Okay, welcome to my fifth and final video, hopefully, that I'm going to have to record during the past 24 hours. I'm going to go through a little bit of chapter 14 now for you. So last night I made some videos that went through the last half of chapter 13 on development, and now we're going to move on to chapter 14, which is theories of personality. There's not a whole lot to cover yet. I've just went through the first type of theories, the first approach, which is the psychodynamic approach. So hopefully this shouldn't be too long of a video, but it'll give you a bit of an introduction, and then next week we'll be able to pick up where we left off and continue on with chapter 14. Just a note, apologies again. I'm still kind of under the weather, so I may be making some sniffling noises and things like that, but I'll try my best to get through this as quickly, as concisely as possible. So, in terms of theories of personality, this chapter is going to explore how psychologists define and study personality. The definition of personality, as per your textbook, is a distinctive pattern of behavior, mannerisms, thoughts, motives, and emotions that characterizes an individual over time and across different situations. So these traits are kind of very stable over time, is basically what this definition is getting at. This pattern can consist of many distinctive traits. So you can have habitual ways of thinking, behaving, and feeling. That's basically the definition of a trait. So being shy, outgoing, hostile, friendly, confident, those are all examples of traits. So these kind of habitual ways of thinking, behaving, and feeling. The topics in this chapter will include a review of the oldest theory, which is the psychodynamic view, the newest theory, which is the genetic view, as well as leading approaches to personality not covered by either of the two. So we'll talk about the environmental approach, cultural approach, and humanist and narrative approaches. So there's quite a bit of content in this chapter. So we'll begin with an overview of the older theories of personality, which would be the psychodynamic theories. And of course, when you hear psychodynamic, you probably think of Freud. As we've mentioned, Freud was very into his psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theories. It's all about the unconscious motives and desires. So the first psychodynamic theory of personality is Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. And we talked about psychoanalysis before in terms of being his theories, and it's also a method of psychotherapy, but it's also a theory of personality as well. And it contains many terms that you may find familiar, such as repression, regression, denial, and displacement. You've probably heard these terms used before, that somebody's repressing something, or they've regressed, or they're in denial. All of these terms are things that are related to Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. So his theory is considered psychodynamic because it involves unconscious energy dynamics within the individual. Again, as with all of his theories, we're talking about those unconscious motives, conflicts, and attachments. The term dynamic, the dynamic portion of the word, is not used in today's sense. Today we might say someone who's dynamic is kind of powerful or energetic, but it's instead used in a more physics sense to refer to the motion and balance of systems under the action of external or internal forces. So it's more so referring to the fact that you've got these systems, these unconscious motives and desires, who are all kind of balancing and conflicting with each other, and are under the influence of both external and internal forces. Today's current psychodynamic theories do differ from Freud's original theory, but all share an emphasis on unconscious processes in the mind as well as childhood experiences. So the things that you experience in childhood can determine the personality traits that you'll show as an adult. So Freud believed, and you've probably heard again of these terms, that the unconscious revealed itself through art, dreams, jokes, apparent accidents, and slips of the tongue, which he called Freudian slips. So for example, your textbook talks about when introducing somebody at a formal occasion, instead of saying the honorable member from Hull, they said the honorable member from Hell. And so basically Freud would say that that wasn't just a slip of the tongue, that was actually what that person who was announcing it was unconsciously thinking. They probably harbored some negative feelings towards the person, and therefore when they slipped up and said Hell instead of Hull, they were kind of revealing their true feelings towards that person. His theory states that personality consists of three major systems. Again, these may be familiar. The id, which is present at birth. It is an unconscious psychological motive, includes these unconscious psychological motives to avoid pain and to obtain pleasure. So there are two competing instincts related to the id. You have the life or sexual instinct, which is fueled by a psychic energy known as libido, and the death or aggressive instinct. So basically he said that energy kind of builds up and there will be a tension result between these two competing instincts, and you discharge this tension in the form of reflex actions, physical symptoms, or uncensored mental images and forbidden thoughts. So this was the very kind of primal instincts, those aggressive and sexual urges. The second part was the ego. So the ego is second to emerge, whereas, like we said, the id was present from birth. So the ego acts as the referee between the needs of instinct and the demands of society. It helps to kind of put a rein on the id's desires for sex and aggression, and it represents kind of reason and good sense. And he said that this one was both conscious and unconscious, so partly conscious and partly unconscious. And then finally, the third major system was the superego. So the superego is the last system to develop of the three, and it represents the voice of conscience. So it represents morality and parental authority. It judges the activities of the id, so it kind of looks down upon the id, and in this way it makes us feel both pride and shame. If we do good things, then it makes us feel good about ourselves, but if we give in to the id's desires, it will make us feel shameful and guilty. And it is partly conscious, but largely not. So id is unconscious, ego is both conscious and unconscious, and superego is mostly unconscious, but partly conscious. So according to Freud, then, a healthy person must keep all three of these systems in check. If someone is too controlled by their id, they're going to be impulsive and selfish, going after kind of everything they desire without caring about the thoughts and feelings of others. If they are too controlled by the superego, they're going to be rigid, moralistic, and bossy, so kind of too high and mighty. And if they have a weak ego, they won't be able to balance the personal needs and wishes with the social duties and realistic imitations. So they won't really be able to balance the desires of the id with the requirements of the superego. If a person feels threatened when the wishes of the id conflict with social rules, the ego has weapons at its command to relieve this tension. So if you have that conflict going on and the person becomes threatened by it, the ego can use these unconscious strategies known as defense mechanisms. And again, many of these terms should be familiar to you just from daily life and from movies and TV shows and things like that. So these defense mechanisms, which relate to those words we talked about earlier, such as repression, denial, and regression, they basically deny or distort reality in order to protect us from conflict or anxiety. And they're actually healthy in a lot of circumstances. They become unhealthy only when they cause self-defeating behavior and emotional problems. So they can be very helpful to us in a lot of ways to help us deal with the conflict, but they can become unhealthy in certain circumstances. So we'll go through a few of the major defense mechanisms now. So 5 of the primary defense mechanisms, as identified by Freud and later analysts. The first is repression, which is when a threatening idea, memory, or emotion is blocked from consciousness. It involves both the unconscious expulsion and conscious suppression. Now, this is the way Freud meant it to be, that it was involving both the unconscious expulsion of disturbing material as well as conscious suppression of this type of material, but modern analysts tend to think of it as only unconscious. So this is Freud's original definition as listed in your PowerPoint here. The second primary defense mechanism is projection, and that is when a person's own unacceptable or threatening feelings are repressed and attributed to someone else. So your textbook gives the example of a person who is embarrassed about their sexual feelings towards a certain ethnic group, so they have these feelings that they deem unacceptable. They may say, well, those people are all dirty-minded and oversexed. So they're basically taking their own kind of shameful feelings that they feel like they shouldn't shouldn't be feeling or they feel threatened by, and saying that it's actually someone else who feels that way. The third defense mechanism is displacement. And displacement occurs when people direct their emotions towards something, so a thing, an animal, or another person, other than the real object of their feelings. So, if someone is angry at their mother for the way they treated them during childhood, in the therapy situation, they may lash out at their therapist and kind of take that anger that they feel towards their parent and direct it towards the therapist, or, maybe direct it towards their spouse or someone else or their own children later on in life. There is a case in which displacement can be considered a positive thing. We have a term called sublimation that you see here. So sublimation occurs when displacement serves a higher cultural or socially useful purpose, such as in the creation of arts and inventions. So if you're able to take maybe your aggressive tendencies or take maybe your forbidden sexual urges and say direct them into painting or writing music or something like that. So you basically take those negative urges and direct them into something that is more socially useful, such as the creation of art or the creation of some kind of invention that might be helpful to others. The fourth defense mechanism is regression. And regression occurs when a person reverts to a previous stage of psychological development. So there are cases in which children may regress when they go through difficult life circumstances. So, for example, a child who's, maybe 8-10 years old, if their parents are getting a divorce, they may start doing things that they did during infancy or when they were a toddler, such as sucking their thumb or maybe they used to be afraid of the dark and they got over it, but they regain that fear. So it's basically regressing to the way you felt or the way you behaved during a previous stage of your psychological development. And adults too may regress when under pressure. So if they're in a high pressure situation, they may, at times throw tantrums and things like that. And the fifth is your denial. So denial is when people refuse to admit that something unpleasant is happening. So they want to try to protect their self-image and preserve the illusion of invulnerability, so kind of that it can't happen to me feeling. So they basically just kind of hide the problem and pretend it doesn't exist. So for example, if they're being mistreated by a partner, if someone's being abused by their spouse and they say, oh, no, nothing's wrong, like, I fell and hurt myself, they kind of deny that there's a problem. Or that they have a problem, such as, alcohol or drug abuse. They won't be willing to admit, maybe even to themselves, that there's an issue there. Or even that they are feeling a forbidden emotion. So all of these things that may be considered unpleasant, people just they're in denial about them. They decide that, nope, it's not happening. I choose to kind of believe it isn't happening to me. So we'll move on a bit to the development of personality. We know that those defense mechanisms are very important when conflicts occur. So Freud also believed that personality developed through a series of psychosexual stages, in which sexual energies take different forms as the child matures. So just as we talked about with the ego and the superego kind of emerging over time, he basically said that there were these psychosexual stages that we had to go through during development, and you'll see that they kind of correlate to when some of those major systems develop. So each stage, he said, produces a certain amount of frustration, anxiety, and conflict, which must be resolved. If it is not, the child may remain fixated at the current stage. And you'll see right away, if you look at the very first stage here, oral stage, you've probably heard the term oral fixation before, right? So that's kind of where this comes from. It's basically saying that if during the oral stage of development that child was unable to remedy the conflict that occurred, they may remain fixated at that stage and later on in life have an oral fixation. So the first stage, the oral stage, occurs during the first year of life. Basically, during this time, babies experience the world through their mouths. If they become fixated at this stage, they will seek oral gratification as adults. So doing things such as smoking, overeating, nail biting, all of these could be indicative of an oral fixation. They also may become clinging and dependent, just like a nursing child would have been at that stage. So basically what he's saying is you are unable to progress adequately through this stage and resolve the conflict of the oral stage, then later on you may exhibit symptoms of oral fixation as an adult. The second psychosexual stage was the anal stage. So anal stage basically lasts from about ages 2 to 3. And at this point, toilet training and bodily waste control are of key importance to the child. They must learn how to use the bathroom and control their urges to excrete their bodily waste, to keep them to that kind of contained area of the toilet. If they become fixated at this stage, they may become one of two things: either anal retentive, which is someone who holds everything in and is obsessed with neatness, or anal expulsive, which is someone who is the exact opposite. They're very messy and disorganized. The third stage is what was in Freud's mind the most crucial stage of personality formation. He called it the phallic or the Oedipal stage. So at this stage, and not only is it the most crucial in Freud's mind, but it's also one of the most controversial by far, he said that children unconsciously wish to possess the parent of the opposite sex and get rid of the parent of the same sex. So this is basically what's known as the Oedipus complex. After Oedipus in old Greek mythology, essentially he was a person who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. So that's basically what they're saying the child is going through at this point. So he believed that boys and girls went through this stage differently. He said boys are very prideful of their penises, and basically the first time during this stage that they end up seeing a girl who is naked, they are horrified to find out that she doesn't have a penis. So they have to kind of think in their mind, well, why would she not have a penis? And what they conclude, because at this point, keep in mind, as Freud is saying, this is the point at which the male child, would want to possess the mother and to be rid of the father or be in conflict with the father. But once he sees that the girl does not have a penis, he says, oh my goodness, that must be because her father is very powerful and he's cut it off. So basically, through that realization of the fact that girls do not have penises and the assumption that that's because their powerful father must have cut it off, they learn then to respect the father and repress the desires that they have for their mothers. So at this point, because they feel as though the father is powerful and they must respect them, they begin to identify with their fathers. And at this point, Freud would say the superego has emerged, so that kind of higher sense of morality. However, obviously, girls do not have penises, and so they cannot go through this stage in the same way. So Freud had to come up with another theory about what might be happening during this stage of development for females. So he basically said that, well, girls, because they don't have penises, must conclude that they already lost their penises, and therefore they're left with only a lingering sense of penis envy. So they are upset and jealous because they don't have penises. And he said that this, because they didn't have to go through that process in which they, kind of determined their father was powerful, or I guess in their point, determined their mother was powerful and identified with her, they develop a much weaker superego than the males would. So once this Oedipus complex is resolved, which happens about ages 5 or 6, so basically this is all occurring between essentially the ages 3 to 5 or 6, so once it's been resolved and the child has developed their superego, the child's personality is said to have been fundamentally formed. So then there's 2 other stages, and these are much less talked about. Like I said, the Oedipal stage is really the main topic of conversation. You have the latency stage, which starts at around 5 or 6 whenever the Oedipal complex is resolved. And it's a non-sexual stage, which basically prepares you for the 5th stage, which is the genital stage. And this stage begins at puberty and leads to adult sexuality. So that's kind of all you need to know about those 2 stages. The main ones to keep in mind will be the first 3, and in particular the third. So, have some conclusions with respect to psychoanalysis, so Freud's specific psychodynamic theory of personality. In summary, he believed that your adult personality is shaped by how you move through the psychosexual stages, which defense mechanisms you used, and whether your ego is strong enough to balance the id and the superego. So basically, he took all of the three things we just talked about, those major systems, the defense mechanisms, and the psychosexual stages, and used these to determine how your adult personality is formed. Psychoanalysis, of course, captured the public imagination in Europe and North America due to his explicit content. A lot of this stuff, talking about sexual urges in children and these kind of things were very controversial and very kind of flashy, and so it definitely captured the public interest, but it also produced a sharp rift with the emerging schools of empirical psychology. It was very unscientific in a lot of its methods. So even today, some people believe that Freud's framework was timeless and brilliant, while others think psychoanalytical theory is nonsense. And just a few things to point out, there was very little empirical support of any of these components of his theory. Freud was not considered a very overly competent scientist or even a successful clinician. In fact, he often was known to bully his patients and to ignore evidence that went against his beliefs, so he kind of suffered from the confirmation bias that we discussed previously. So there's a lot of kind of negatives here and things that kind of go against this theory, but like I said, just the fact that these theories were so explicit and so kind of controversial at the time did create definitely a lasting legacy in terms of Freud's theories and his initial conclusions. So despite some of the more negative aspects, his work did also have some positive aspects as well. He welcomed women into psychoanalysis. He was very welcoming for women to come and study within the school of psychoanalysis. He wrote about the negative effects of suppressing women's sexuality, which, as we talked about when we talked about sexual motivation in chapter 12, for a very long time, especially back when Freud was active as a researcher, people were it was kind of taboo to talk about women's sexuality, but Freud was one of the first to say that it was harmful for us to kind of suppress the fact that women have their own sexuality and to not talk about these types of things. And he also argued that homosexuality was neither a sin or a perversion, which was, again, something that was very controversial at the time, and at a time when, people used to actually think that homosexuality was a mental illness at one point. So for him to be making these types of claims was well before his time, but he definitely did have some of those positive aspects to his research as well. So overall, we would say that he was a mixture of intellectual vision and blindness. In some respects, he was ahead of his time and did have some interesting conclusions. In other respects, a lot of his conclusions were complete nonsense and had no empirical support. He was both sensitive at times, like when he wanted to talk about, women's sexuality and about homosexuality being nothing to make fun of and discourage. But then at the same time, he was arrogant in that he would not look for things that went against his views. So a little bit of genius, a little bit of insanity, essentially, like we've talked about before when we've mentioned Freud in class. So now we'll move on to some of the other psychodynamic approaches. Of course, psychoanalysis was one of the oldest and one of the most influential, but there are a couple other major psychodynamic approaches that we'll mention. So some of Freud's followers modified his theories from within, while others broke away from him or were rejected by him. So some of them kind of continued in his school of psychoanalysis and came up with their own theories and components, whereas others went on to kind of break away and start their own schools. Women, of course, in particular, were not overly pleased about his theories on penis envy, that, we all are envious because we don't have a penis, and therefore we're not able to develop as fully in terms of the superego and things like that. They considered these results unscientific and insulting. And a lot of women said that when women feel inferior to men, we should look to the disadvantages women live with and their second-class status, as opposed to silly constructs such as penis envy. So we'll move on and we'll talk about two of the other major psychodynamic approaches, and they are the Jungian school, Jungian theory, and the object relation school. So, for Jungian theory, Carl Jung was once a close friend of Freud's until they quarreled viciously about the nature of unconscious. So they were once very close friends and thought shared a lot of the same beliefs, but then they had a very big fight about the nature of unconscious and went their separate ways. So Jung stated that in addition to an individual's own consciousness, so we each have our own consciousness and unconsciousness, I believe that should say, we all share a vast collective unconsciousness. So we have our own personal unconscious, and we also have a collective unconscious that is shared universally. And so he said that this collective unconscious contains universal memories, symbols, images, and themes. And he labeled these universal themes and memories and symbols as archetypes. So he said that archetypes can be images, for example, the mandala, which is kind of a magic circle thought to symbolize unity of self and unity of life and totality of self. Or figures that are found in fairy tales and legends, such as the hero. So, you tell stories, typically there's a hero type character, Earth Mother, so that kind of nurturing force, or Wicked Witch. So, the negative, wicked person in the stories and the fairy tales. And so basically what he's saying is these archetypes tend to exist across all cultures and all societies. In stories in all of these different areas, you would hear about these same kind of things. So, for example, he talked about the shadow archetype, which represents the bestial evil side of human nature. So characters such as Dracula, Darth Vader, Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, all of these negative characters are examples of the shadow archetype. So basically what he's saying is that worldwide, regardless of culture and society, if you're telling stories, you're typically going to have a character that fits this archetype. So therefore, there must be some kind of collective unconsciousness that's universal and contains these types of archetypes. And scholars have actually found that some archetypes do appear in stories and images of virtually every society. So he said basically that people were motivated not only by past conflicts, but also by their desires to fulfill themselves. And he was also among the first to identify extroversion and introversion as a basic dimension of personality. So he definitely did have some, in addition to these kind of archetypes, he definitely did have some lasting effects on the realm of personality psychology. And although he did share with Freud a fascination with the darker aspects of personality, he also had more confidence in the positive and forward-moving strength of the ego. So, like I was just saying, having that motivation to fulfill yourself and things such as that would be considered more of, I guess, the positive strength of the ego. But overall, his work was still not overly empirical. He had some followers, and he did leave behind quite a legacy, but unfortunately, after his falling out with Freud, he suffered kind of a psychotic break, and he showed, I guess, what they say is his own evil side when he was writing basically pro-Nazi propaganda and things like that. So, despite the fact that he did leave some enduring theories and concepts, unfortunately, he met a bit more of a tragic end than some. So we'll move on now to talk briefly about the object relation school, which is the second other type of psychodynamic approach. So this school was developed in Great Britain by Melanie Klein, D.W. Winnicott, and others. So these theorists believed that the central problem in life was trying to find a balance between the need for independence and the need for others. And they said that this requires constant adjustment to separations and losses. So if you lose, if you suffer a breakup or you suffer a loss of someone, basically you have to work through these type of things and balance your need for independence with the need for contact with others. So they basically said that the way that we react to these losses is largely determined by our experiences in the first year or two of life. So they related your adult capacity to deal with these types of losses back to how you were treated as a child and the attachment you formed as a child. So they said if a baby's need for recognition is not heeded within this first year or two, the baby's personality would be warped. So as they grow up, they're going to not develop their personality properly. So we use the word object when we're talking about the object relation school because the attachment is not just to the mother. It's not, mother relations, but to the infant's evolving perception of her. So the child creates a mental representation of the mother as well as other important adults, and these mental representations affect their personality throughout life. So it differs from Freud in that both sexes in this theory, they first identify with the mother. So it's talking more about how they identify with their mother as a child, whereas Freud, of course, was saying that the boys would want the mothers and try to break away from the fathers, whereas the girls would want the father and try to break away from the mother. So this theory is stating that both sexes first identify with the mother. So this approach can be applied for many different purposes. They've applied it to try to predict if a client will benefit from psychotherapy in order to help people deal with disability and loss, as well as to try to explain why some people harass others online. So basically they say, like we said, both sexes first identify with the mother, but then boys must break away from their mothers to develop their masculine identity. So basically they say as a result of this, men tend to develop more rigid boundaries between themselves and others than women do because they have to break away from that identification with their mother in order to develop their masculinity. So, now that we've covered some of the major psychodynamic theories of personality, we're going to talk a little bit about evaluating these type of theories. And like we said, the thing with psychodynamic theories is they all focus on the unconscious for the most part. So, of course, as we know, whenever you're talking about anything that's unconscious, there are certain empirical issues that arise. So modern psychodynamic theories differ in many ways. There's many different ones, as we just gave 3 very different examples there. But they do share a general belief that to understand personality, we must look to unconscious dynamics and origins. However, many psychologists in other fields regard most psychodynamic ideas as unscientific. So most of the major assumptions in these theories have not been supported scientifically. For example, there's no scientific evidence for repression of traumatic experiences. And, we might ask the question, how do object relation theorists know that a true self is being suppressed? So these types of questions can't be answered empirically when we talk about psychodynamic theories, or haven't been answered empirically. Psychodynamic theories, therefore, we have seen them to be guilty of 3 scientific failings. So 3 areas, basically, in which they fail to meet the criteria for empirical study. The first is that these psychodynamic theories violate the principle of falsifiability. And you may remember this from way back in the very beginning chapters when we were talking about research and critical thinking. A theory that is impossible to disconfirm, so that there's no way of you being able to disconfirm it, is not scientific. Followers often accept ideas because they seem intuitively right, and their experience supports it. So, basically, you're creating a theory that there's no way to falsify, because if they accept it based on kind of anecdotal evidence, and then they call everyone who goes against them in denial or defensive, then basically they're not giving you a way to ever falsify their claims, and therefore it's violating that principle of falsifiability. The second failing is that the psychodynamic theories draw universal principles from the experience of a few atypical patients. So, for example, Freud and others generalized from a few individuals, but they failed to confirm observations by studying larger and representative samples. So they would find a trend in, maybe 3 or 4 people, and then they would assume that that trend exists globally. They would take the experiences of a few and generalize them to the many, and as we know, that's not a scientific thing to do. Just as you can't take a case study and create a theory from it, or well, I guess you could, but then you'd still have to test it with a greater amount of people. You can't take the experiences of a few and create a theory without then going on to test out your claims with a larger, more representative sample. And the third failing is that psychodynamic theories base theories of personality development on the retrospective accounts of adults. So these theories based are based on themes and adult recollections of their childhood. So you're basically asking adults to think back on what happened to them as children. But as we know, memory is often inaccurate. And when you look at things in this way, you're asking them now as an adult to look back on their childhood, you may create an illusion of causality. So because your childhood happened before your adulthood, it's a lot of people have the tendency to say, well, the thing that happened when I was a child must have caused the later thing, because one happens after the other in chronological order. But if you actually look at the results of longitudinal studies, which study people across time, so actually study people in their childhood and then study them as adults, you'll often see very different results. So based on the fact that adults sometimes have these inaccurate memories, and that you've got this illusion of causality where it doesn't necessarily exist, you often find very different results if you actually study things empirically and longitudinally over time. So despite serious problems, as mentioned above, some psychodynamic concepts have been empirically validated. So for example, there is evidence for the major defense mechanisms. The interaction of the mind and body have been demonstrated in the generation of stress-related physical problems, and we are often unaware of the motives behind our own actions. So basically your takeaway from this section is that the psychodynamic theories of personality are the oldest, and therefore they're very important to mention, if nothing else, just to kind of provide us a basis of how the theories of personality developed. And while they do have some serious scientific failings, they also have given us some empirically validated information, so some useful empirically validated concepts and things that have helped us further our development of personality theory. So that's the end of this section on psychodynamic theory. A series of personality. So we'll pick up next week and we'll talk about the genetic theories and the other kind of more minor approaches, the cultural and the narrative and things like that. I'll see you all next week.